Whatever type of music you're into, it may surprise you to learn that things that sound very different from each other on the surface are in fact using the same basic musical tools and techniques. Looking at the mechanics of a beautiful tune, a sweet chord, or a hot driving rhythm is a gratifyingly democratic process. When you analyse the nuts and bolts of music, you find that the apparent differences between musical cultures, between Eastern and Western, between folk and jazz, or between classical and pop, start to melt away. The underlying techniques and tricks of good music can be and are applied to virtually any and every style.
In this series, I'm going to look under music's bonnet and find out what makes it tick, how music works. We'll be looking at rhythm, harmony, and bass, but we'll start with music's soul, melody. Melody is music's most powerful tool when it comes to touching our emotions. Our mothers sing lullabies to us when we're infants, and tests have shown that we can even, as babies, recognise tunes we heard in the womb. Tunes can act as a bridge between cultures when language fails us. People can feel totally wrapped up in operas and musicals whose text they don't understand or don't remember because the melodies somehow convey the story and the feelings on their own. Tunes can inspire patriotism, hope and redemption, and they lie at the heart of most of the world's faiths. They can express love, loss and longing. What is it then about a good melody that makes it so effective?
At first hearing, all the world's many musical systems, from Africa to Indonesia, from the Andes to the Urals, do indeed sound very different from each other. But actually, some melodic principles are universal and hold true for every culture on Earth.
Listen to these 5 songs from around the world. They all share something simple and profound.
Alunde, 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 aluya. Alunde, 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 aluya.
让我来将你摘下，送给别人家。茉莉花呀，茉莉花。
Deep river, my home is over Jordan.
गाइए गणपति जगवंदना गाइए गणपति जगवंदना
I am sailing home again, cross the sea.
These songs are all based on 5 notes. What's more, they all use the same 5 notes. That's right, every music system in the world shares these 5 notes in common. Indeed, they're so fundamental to every note composed or performed anywhere on the planet that it seems, like our instinct for language, that they were pre-installed in us when we were born. These 5 notes are a human genetic inheritance, like the fingers on our hands. In the West, we call tunes made from these 5 notes pentatonic, after the ancient Greek word for 5, pentas. These are they.
It's easy to find the pentatonic notes on a piano keyboard because they're the black notes. An enormous number of popular tunes throughout history have been based on a pentatonic shape, especially the sing-along anthems, from Auld Lang Syne to Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, and Mull of Kintyre.
A lot of anthemic rock songs oscillate around pentatonic patterns too. The famous riff from Led Zeppelin's Whole Lotta Love is quintessential pentatonica. But basing your melody on the pentatonic pattern didn't mean you were stuck with just those 5 notes. All musical cultures developed more notes as time went on. But it's important to emphasize that having lots of notes didn't make your tune necessarily better, it just made it different. The key thing is not how many notes you have, but what you do with them. So our next task is to dismantle the elements of a tune one by one and work out what they're up to. How does melody work? Let's get some definitions out of the way first. There are 3 main ingredients to every melody: the notes you choose, how high or low they are, and the pattern they make one after another. So let's start with the notes you pick in the first place. In theory, the choice is infinite. How many notes you have depends on how small you want the distance between the notes to be.
If you arrange your notes too closely together, you might have a problem distinguishing between them. My synthesizer can tell me that these 2 notes, this one and this one, are measurably quite different notes, but only a very finely tuned human ear could pick that up. To most people, it sounds like the same note. It's no surprise then that all known musical systems have chosen notes that are recognisably different. Here's the Western one. Think of the notes as rungs on a ladder. This, in short, is how all musical scales or ladders work. You decide how close together you want your rungs to be, and you make each rung a note. Now, some musical systems have 24 rungs in their ladder. In Western music, we have 12. In Chinese and Indian music, there are many more rungs on the ladder, and so the notes are much closer together. So we've got our basic notes then, but now we have to decide how high or low these notes are. The measuring of how high or low a musical note is called pitch. Now, if I blow down this organ pipe, I will produce a note. The note is called A. But if I blow down this other organ pipe exactly half the size, it'll also produce a note called A. This A is obviously much higher. Same note name, different pitch. The pitch of a musical note tells you how high or low it actually is. On our Western musical ladder, every 12th rung is another A. The next element in melody is the distance between notes, between your A and your C and your E and your G, for example. These distances are called intervals, and they've got nothing to do with queuing at the ladies' loo when you go to the theatre. Intervals are the distances between the rungs you choose to play on your musical ladder. In Western music, the smallest interval is from one rung of the ladder to another. It's called a semitone. As you'd expect then, a whole tone is an interval of 2 rungs on the musical ladder.
It's a fact that seems to be true wherever you are in the world, that people generally find it easier to sing whole tones than they do semitones. To sing this interval, ah, rather than this interval, ah. Because of this, movement from whole tone to whole tone underpins a gigantic amount of the world's oldest repertoire of religious and folk songs, like Christian plain chant, which is hundreds of years old. Plain chant moves step by adjacent or nearly adjacent step, meandering from note to note without any unexpected leaps or falls. The range of the tune fits bang in the middle of anyone's natural singing voice. It's almost as if it's being made up on the spot by the singers themselves. It sounds solemn and reflective.
But here's another tune which moves around by adjacent steps, also heavy on the whole tones, which isn't at all holy or solemn. It's a Bulgarian folk song.
Tam si zabravi
The fact is, these tune types, chant and folk song, are what nearly all vocal music sounded like in distant centuries. They're just the ones that have survived. Even when the words had very different meanings, the way the voice glided about from note to note was often very similar. Gradually, though, those intervals began to widen beyond the semitone and the whole tone to make tunes that were more ambitious, had a greater vocal range, and were less predictable. In the Middle Ages, the third was popular, as was the fourth, the fifth, and by the Renaissance you could expect to hear an interval as wide as a sixth, or even a seventh. To make a tune, we can mix and match these intervals to our heart's content. Almost any combination of our basic repertoire of notes could turn into a half-decent melody. To prove it, let's do a little experiment.
I've come to the splendid new Sage Gateshead to find some willing music lovers to help me construct a tune.
Now, each of these counters represent the most used of the Western note intervals, 1 to 8, yellow up, blue down, and I'm going to ask random passers-by if they will pick out of this bag counters of these intervals, and then just like in the game of consequences, we're going to put them in a row and play the collectively composed melody. Roll up, roll up. There you go. Thank you very much. Excellent. Thank you. Excellent. Oh, haven't got many blues, so here we go. Couple more. Thank you. Now, using my starting note of C, I'm going to play this tune that we randomly chose together. Well, I don't think it'll make #1 next week, but you can also see that it's not that weird either. And what composers have been doing for hundreds of years is taking these notes, pitches and intervals and making lovely tunes out of them. It's the same task whether you're J.S. Bach or Burt Bacharach, Fritz Kreisler or the Kaiser Chiefs, or Carl Maria von Weber or Andrew Lloyd Webber.
Once you've got your basic tune, you can start having fun with it. Of course, you don't have to pull your melody out of a hat. There are tried and trusted musical templates that give composers their starting points. There are useful comparisons to be made with storytelling. Storytelling relies on a number of archetypes handed down over the generations. For instance, boy meets girl, family don't approve, things go wrong and end in a desperate suicide pact. Or man goes in search of Holy Grail, ends up finding truth was to be found at home all along, and so on.
So it is with tunes. There are ancient patterns and arrangements of notes that function as archetypes for millions of melodies. Over time, these archetypes have been arranged into note groups or scales that give the composer or the improvising musician a template with which to begin. Different cultures have developed their own sets, as you'd expect, but the concept of note families is basic to us all.
These note groups or scales are called modes, and they all have a subtly different effect on the listener's emotions.
The ancient Greeks, Indians and Chinese all associated the different modes with different purposes or moods, for morning or evening, happy or sad, for begging prayer or ecstatic rejoicing, for mealtimes, birthdays, festivals, weddings, you name an occasion, they had a mode for it. In Europe, the modes were handed down from the ancient Greeks and became the bread and butter of medieval plain chant and folk song. They were given names like Dorian, Aeolian, Phrygian and Lydian.
As an example, let's look at one of these note families, the Aeolian mode. Here it is in action in a famous and ancient tune. Veni, veni, Emmanuel, captivum solve Israel, qui gemit in exilio, privatus Dei filio, gaude, gaude, Emmanuel, masceto pro te Israel, qui gemit in. For centuries then, this was how melodies were made. You find a mode that matches your mood and just make sure that every note in your melody comes from that mode. A tune in the Aeolian mode will sound solemn and sorrowful. This worked fine until around the 16th century. After all, if it was good enough for the Pope in Rome, it was good enough for the rest of Christendom. The thing is, it wasn't fine for the English, who were getting restless and independent-minded, and they started playing fast and loose with the modal rules. They found out what a lot of singers had found out before them, namely that certain modes are easier to sing in than others, and that the modes could be rather inflexible. Take the Aeolian mode that we heard earlier. This is a lovely mode, sad but lovely. Yet musicians found that when their tune was heading in an upwards direction, yearning and reaching towards the top of the phrase, it was better to sharpen the notes. Sharpening means raising by a semitone. So instead of the regulation scale, they had this modified version. But on the way down, no yearning and reaching required, they left the mode as it was. The result was a mode with a variable rung on its ladder. Not so great a crime, you may think, but in Britain, the variable rung caught on like wildfire. They couldn't get enough of it. They went variable rung mad. By the time of Elizabeth I, they were taking all those leading notes that were heading upwards and sharpening or raising them, and all the ones coming down, they were flattening or lowering them. So great was their passion for it. But there was one peculiar side effect to all this that no one had really seen coming. What if you were singing with someone else, and you were heading in an upward direction and they were heading in a downward direction at the same time? Wouldn't you get a horrendous pile-up with two rungs competing for the same slot? The answer is yes, you would. Here's a famous example of one of these note collisions. It's from the Coventry Carol, though it's got nothing to do with a nice girl from the Midlands.
Child, bye bye, lule, lule, thy little tiny child, bye bye.
This is what happens. The soprano singing the tune has to sing these two notes.
Bye-bye, Luli.
Because they're clearly heading in an upwards direction, they've been squeezed up or sharpened. But at the same time, the tenor, who sings on the same rung of the ladder, is heading downwards, so his note has to be left flattened.
Bye-bye, Luli.
And together, the sharp and the flat notes have to be sung simultaneously, creating what to modern ears sounds like a weird discord, but to Tudor ears was an oral delicacy. They even gave it a saucy name, false relations.
Bye-bye, Luli.
Though the deliberate collisions and scrunches eventually died out, folk musicians in the British Isles never really lost their love of these modified modes. What's more, another group of musicians unwittingly came up against this same variable rung principle 300 years later and 4,000 miles across the Atlantic. They were the early pioneers of the blues. Listen to this song by Blind Lemon Jefferson, one of the founders of the blues, in a 1926 recording of Long Lonesome Blues.
I walk from Dallas, I walk from Wichita Falls.
I know the recording's old and scratchy, but something very significant is happening in that singing. Blind Lemon Jefferson is making some of the notes bend downwards slightly. He's flattening them. These are some of the earliest preserved examples of a phenomenon known as blue notes. Without the blue notes, his first phrase would sound like this. I walked from Dallas, I walked to Wichita Falls. But he sings, I walked to Wichita Falls. He doesn't bend down all the notes, just the ones on the syllables walked and Wichita. Here he is again, and listen out for the way the notes seem to sag down on those two words.
I walk from Dallas, I walk from Wichita Falls.
Why are these notes bent downwards and not the rest? Indeed, why do it at all? The blues developed in rural America, but their melodic patterns had African roots. In particular, it's the use of blue notes, which fall outside the Western melodic ladder, that link the Tudor rebels to the early blues composers. They too preferred a variable rung on their ladder, but instead of going for an either-or approach to the offending notes, they went for a bendy rung option instead. The blues mode always squeezes the rung down. It's neither this note nor this note. It's the note in between. We'll be coming back to the changes in American melody brought about by blue notes, but first we'll look at the music that came in between the Tudor rebels and the blues. Classical music. In the next part, I'm going to look at the melodic revolution brought about by classical music and how we are still writing tunes according to those changes, no matter what our musical background.
Composers in the time of Shakespeare, as we've seen, began to find the medieval modes they'd inherited increasingly inflexible. Plus, there was a kind of snobbery thing creeping into music which separated the music that toffs listened to from the songs and dances that ordinary people enjoyed. So as the 17th century drifted into the 18th, a new system for upper crust music duly emerged. Partly its job was to get rid of all those ambiguities and collisions that Tudor composers were so fond of, and partly its job was to make a system where all instruments and all singers could play together, to create a kind of standard for European music. It's sometimes called diatonic, and this is how it worked.
At its core lay one simple idea, to take one or two of the old modes and make them the pattern for all music. Like all takeover bids, it involved a couple of mergers. They took parts of the old Dorian and Aeolian modes, merged them into one, borrowed a detail from the Tudors, and hey presto, they had the new all-purpose minor scale. The detail they borrowed from the Tudors was that rule about sharpening or raising the penultimate note in the musical ladder if it was heading in an upward direction, just like in the Coventry Carol. The arrival of the all-purpose minor scale had two big advantages over its modal predecessors. The first was that the same arrangement of notes worked no matter what note or pitch you started your scale on. So I could start a minor scale on this note, G, or I could start it on this note, E. Wherever you start your melody, the new minor can cope because its pattern is unchanged and fixed. The old modes were much more attached to their chosen starting points. The new minor can start on any of the 12 semitones of the Western ladder. Why does this matter? Well, because in those days, most of the instruments they had, keyboards, flutes, trumpets, horns, etc., could only play in certain modes. They could only play a limited number of notes. It was as if all the instruments spoke different languages that had developed separately and they couldn't easily communicate with each other or play together. So having a minor scale that worked the same no matter what note you started on allowed 18th century manufacturers to make instruments that could speak the same language, that could play together. This was the second big gain of the new system. But so far we've only had the sad and solemn minor scale. Happy got the major scale, which was identical to the old Ionian mode with a new name. It was rebranded. What's more, the new major scale and the new minor scale were designed to be totally compatible with each other. You could go from major to minor in the same piece of music as much as you liked. This was a great bonus. The Christmas carol God Rest You Merry Gentlemen does just that. It starts in the key of E minor, all earnest and churchy sounding. God rest you merry gentlemen, let nothing you dismay, for Jesus Christ our Saviour was born upon this day, to save us all from Satan's power when we were gone astray. But when we get to the tidings of comfort and joy, the happy bit, we slink effortlessly into the key of G major. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy, comfort and joy. Finally, just to remind us we shouldn't get too carried away with our Yuletide jollity, at the very end we slink back into the original key of E minor. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy. Composers love to exploit their ability to rock between major and minor, to glide about all over the place in the full knowledge that the system was strong enough to handle any change of gear or maneuver. In this exquisite song by Handel, Angels Ever Bright and Fair, written in 1749, there's a similar journey between major and minor from one section to another. What's more, the voice is leaping around far more than it did in earlier music. Its range is widening. What Handel is creating is a landscape of highs and lows, hills and valleys.
Speed to yon courts by night, clad in robes of virgin white, clad in robes of virgin white, clad in robes of virgin white.
It would be wrong to imagine, though, that the Western diatonic system was imposed by toffs in wigs upon an uninterested or ungrateful general public. Make no mistake, the newly stable diatonic system became incredibly popular in all forms of music, from folk ballads to music hall, and the very same mechanisms that worked for Mozart and Handel are still in robust form today. Every single song that has been a popular hit in the last 100 years has been, without exception, completely diatonic.
High up above or down below, when you're too in love to let it go. But if you never try, you'll never know just what you were. Lights will guide you home and ignite your bones, and I will try to fix you.
Of course, a lovely tune is all very well, but you might want to compose something a bit longer than a 3-minute song. And if so, you're going to have to find ways of managing multiple tunes. Operas and symphonies need a scaffolding or a structure on which to hang their many melodies.
For example, Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto begins with this simple melody. The first time the melody comes, it's presented in its basic form, moody and passionate, but not overcomplicated. Because this concerto was written to show off a solo violinist's virtuoso skill, you'd expect later versions of the tune to be more flashy, which they are. Here it is with its minor key turned to the major, and with the violin using it as a springboard for some fiddle gymnastics. A couple of minutes later, our innocent-sounding melody has become a series of fierce, interrupting outbursts. Instead of playing the melody the whole way through, it's being used more like a theme in a movie or an opera, in short, dramatic snippets. By the end of the first movement of this concerto, we've heard that opening melody in loads of variations, but we never hear it again exactly as it was at the beginning, pure and simple. Mendelssohn has turned it into a voyage of musical exploration.
Western diatonic system completely dominated classical music between about 1700 and 1900. Then things started to fall apart. Cutting-edge composers felt bored and limited by what they saw as the straitjacket of the major-minor system. So they started to look for inspiration elsewhere. Ironically, they sought help from those old folk and ecclesiastical modes.
This process began in Europe, where composers like the great symphonist Gustav Mahler started to incorporate into their music the old modal melodies of the folk music of their own countries. The big story of melody in the last 100 years isn't the invention of new melodic forms, it's the fusing together of existing ones. In Britain, those Tudors with their false relations were dusted down and reintroduced, especially in the music of Ralph Vaughan Williams. His best-known piece was actually based in its entirety on a tune by a Tudor composer, the Fantasia on a theme by Thomas Tallis. Vaughan Williams wrote his Fantasia on this theme in 1910, but with its small, step-by-step, plain chant-like movements, its Phrygian mode, its Elizabethan-style harmonies, it's almost as if we've stepped back 300 years, even despite his rich, lush 20th century string orchestra. Modes didn't just make a triumphant return in 20th century classical music. They're also heard in modern jazz, and you can even find them occasionally in contemporary popular music. One such example is We Work the Black Seam, a song by Sting. Sting was born in Wallsend on the banks of the River Tyne, and everywhere in his work you can detect the sound of his northeastern roots. The Dorian mode of We Work the Black Seam is one such clue.
This has changed for good. Your economic theory said it would. It's hard for us to understand. We can't give up our jobs the way we should.
The Dorian mode of We Work the Black Seam is the same one used in Greensleeves, written in the 16th century. What Sting is doing is associating an ancient British sound with an industry that had been around for centuries.
We work the black seam together.
But the fact that a modern pop song should have its roots in a much older melodic tradition shouldn't come as a surprise, since the seeds of the great explosion of popular song that took place in the 20th century, with America as its engine room, were sown long before in the 18th century's slave traffic from Africa and the 19th century's mass migrations from Europe. In the 20th century, American popular music swept the planet, fusing with indigenous forms to create new melodic patterns and possibilities. In the next part, we'll look at the four main ingredients that crossed the Atlantic and went into the American melody mixer.
just like them pretty girls when they get some motion. Runs oh me boys, oh runs alright. Overruns oh you'll rue the day as the wild goose sails away.
The labourers, convicts and prospectors who crossed the Atlantic from Britain and Ireland took with them their modal folk tunes. Before long, they found themselves working alongside slaves and ex-slaves in the plantations, prairies and railroads of the States. The pentatonic, modal nature of African melodies found an unlikely fit with these Anglo-Celtic song types, and from forms such as the Negro spiritual and revivalist songs of redemption, modern soul music developed.
No, I won't be afraid. Oh, I won't be afraid. Just as long as you stand by me. So darling, darling, stand by me. Oh, stand by me.
But other waves of immigrants brought their melodies to the melting pot of the United States too. Successive migrations by non-conformist religious groups, Puritans, Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians and others, carried their hymns, psalms and rituals with them to their new promised land. Musically, the most influential religious group to come from England were the Shakers. And when they got to America, a strange thing began happening to their melodies. They became, in a word, happier.
'Tis the gift to be simple, 'tis the gift to be free, 'tis the gift to come down where we ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, 'twill be in the valley of love and delight. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend we shan't be ashamed. To turn, turn will be our delight, till by turning, turning we come round right.
'Tis the gift to be simple, like most Shaker songs, was meant to be danced to. Its mood is childlike and optimistic, and this is reflected in its beautifully proportioned and instantly memorable tune. Gone are the melancholy modes of much European folk music and the angst-ridden complexities of classical music. In their place is a sound as pure and clear as an Appalachian mountain stream. In 1944, the composer Aaron Copland borrowed "'Tis a Gift to be Simple" as the basis for a ballet suite. The next development in American melody came at the end of the 19th century, thanks to the successive waves of immigrants from Eastern Europe. Many were Jewish, and the impact their klezmer folk music was to have, particularly on the Broadway and Hollywood show song, was enormous. Jewish melody found a new role as the bedrock of the American musical. Irving Berlin's classic song, Blue Skies, was partly inspired by a Yiddish lullaby, Raisins and Almonds.
Blue skies smiling at me, nothing but blue skies do I see. Oh, bluebirds singing a song, nothing but bluebirds all day long.
The melodies we listen to today are a rich mixture of melodic forms, from pentatonic to major and minor patterns, from church and folk modes to blue notes. The simple combination of notes, pitches and intervals has offered and continues to offer endless opportunities for instrumental music and song.
This is one such song. It was written in 1969 by Paul Simon, a well-travelled New Yorker of Jewish immigrant stock, whose musical influences are African-American gospel, blues, country music and folk. In this song, it's possible to detect the pentatonic influence of African song, the modality of folk, the vocal range of classical song, the reassurance of gospel, and even the uplifting generosity epitomised by the Shaker spiritual. One day, the provenance of these, its musical roots, will have disappeared. Its indestructible melody, on the other hand, will last forever.
When you're weary, feeling small, when tears are in your eyes, I will dry them all. I'm on your side. Get rough, and friends just can't